The summer of 2007 was supposed to be simple. After a long, grueling sophomore year at college, I decided to spend a few weeks at my dad's house to unwind and reconnect. My parents had divorced a few years earlier, and since then, my dad, Martin, had remarried a younger woman named Laura. Laura was striking, to say the least. With her confident demeanor, wavy auburn hair that seemed to glisten in the sunlight, and hazel eyes that could hold anyone's gaze, she had an undeniable presence. It wasn't hard to see why my dad had fallen for her. But as I would soon discover, there was more to Laura than met the eye. The house hadn't changed much since my last visit. The familiar smell of polished wood and fresh flowers greeted me as I stepped inside. It was like stepping into a memory, both comforting and strange. I set my bag down in the hallway, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sounding like an old friend. "Ryan? Look at you!" Laura's voice rang out before I even saw her. She appeared in the doorway, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, her smile wide and warm. Without hesitation, she pulled me into a hug. Her arms lingered just a beat longer than I expected, and I felt her breath near my ear as she said, "It's so good to see you." "Hey, Laura," I replied, stepping back slightly, unsure of what to do with the sudden rush of closeness. She beamed at me, completely unbothered by my hesitation. "Your dad's still at work, but I'm so glad you're here. It's been too long." Her enthusiasm was disarming. "Yeah, it has. The place looks the same, though," I said, glancing around at the familiar furniture and decor. "That's Dad for you," she said with a laugh. "He doesn't like change much, but come on, let me make you something to eat. You must be starving after the trip." "Oh, you don't have to." "Nonsense," she interrupted, waving me off. "Go unpack. I'll whip up a sandwich." Her voice was so full of energy that it left no room for argument. As I headed upstairs to my old room, I couldn't help but notice how different Laura seemed from when I last saw her. She had always been kind, but this felt personal. Later, as I unpacked, the smell of freshly toasted bread wafted up the stairs. I heard Laura humming softly to herself in the kitchen, her voice carrying a tune I didn't recognize. Something about it was comforting, like a small beacon of warmth in this otherwise distant home. When I came back downstairs, she handed me a plate with a sandwich and a glass of iced tea. "Here you go, Chef Laura's special," she said with a wink. "Thanks," I said, taking a bite. It was simple but good, the kind of food that reminded me of home. She sat across from me, watching me eat with an intensity that made me a little self-conscious. "So how's life in the city?" "Yeah, it's busy," I said, shrugging. "You know how it is." Her eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary. "I bet. You always had big dreams." That evening, when my dad finally came home, the house buzzed with a different energy. Dinner was simple but hearty, the three of us seated around the old wooden table. "It's good to have you back, son," Dad said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Good to be back," I replied, though the words felt a bit hollow. Laura chimed in with stories from the past few months, her laughter filling the spaces between my dad's grunts of acknowledgement. But even as she spoke, her gaze flicked toward me, quick, fleeting glances that felt too deliberate to be accidental. I caught one of those looks, and for a moment, our eyes met. She smiled, almost shyly, before returning her focus to her plate. The undercurrent was subtle but undeniable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Laura's warmth wasn't just about being glad to see me. There was something else there, something unspoken, yet palpable, lingering just beneath the surface. The first few days were uneventful. My dad's demanding job as a project manager kept him out late most evenings, leaving Laura and me alone. At first, I busied myself with old friends, avoiding too much time alone with her. But Laura was persistent in drawing me out. She invited me to join her morning yoga sessions. "It's great for stress relief," she said with a smile that was both disarming and strangely intimate. I reluctantly agreed, if only to keep the peace. Over the next few days, I began to let my guard down. Laura had a way of making me laugh, and I found myself enjoying her company. She was easy to talk to, and our conversations often stretched late into the evening when my dad wasn't home. One night, we sat on the porch, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink as the sun set. Laura opened up about her past. "I was engaged once before your dad," she said, her voice soft. "But it didn't work out. He cheated on me." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, listening intently. Your dad? He's a good man, she continued, her eyes distant. But sometimes I feel like I'm just a piece of furniture in his life. You know what I mean? I didn't, but I could sense the loneliness in her voice, and it tugged at something inside me. Everything changed the night my dad left for a 3-day business trip. Laura and I had dinner together, just the two of us. She had cooked spaghetti carbonara, my favorite, and even lit a candle on the table. To celebrate the weekend, she said, pouring us each a glass of wine. I tried to keep it light, cracking a few jokes to ease the strange intimacy of the moment. But Laura wasn't just laughing. She was listening, really listening, her hazel eyes fixed on mine. The way she tilted her head, the soft curve of her lips as she smiled, it was unnervingly captivating. After dinner, she suggested we watch a movie. I picked an action film, something mindless to keep things casual. But halfway through, Laura took the remote and switched it to a romantic comedy. This is more fun, she said, curling up on the couch next to me. Her proximity made me uneasy. I tried to focus on the screen, but her presence consumed me. The warmth of her body radiated through the small space between us. Her scent, something floral, mixed with the faint hint of wine, wrapped around me, intoxicating and familiar. We shared the popcorn bowl, and at one point our hands brushed. I expected her to pull away, but she didn't. Instead, her fingers lingered, soft against mine. I glanced at her, but she was watching the screen as if nothing had happened. Until she wasn't. Ryan, she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the hum of the movie. I turned to her, startled by the way she was looking at me, like I was the only person in the world. Her hazel eyes shimmered in the low light, holding a depth I couldn't decipher. I've been meaning to tell you something, she said, her tone hesitant but deliberate. My heart thudded against my ribcage. What is it? She shifted, turning slightly to face me. Her gaze flicked from my eyes to my lips and back again. You're different, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. You're mature, thoughtful, and you make me feel like I can just be myself. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to respond, to ask what she meant, but my throat was dry. She leaned in slightly, her face closer now. Do you feel it too? She asked. Feel what? I managed to croak. This connection, she said, her hand now resting lightly on mine. Her touch was electric, sending a shiver up my spine. I don't know how to explain it, but being around you, it's different. Time seemed to stand still as she closed the space between us. Her breath was warm, her eyes searching mine. The moment felt inevitable, like gravity pulling us together. But just as her lips brushed mine, the sound of my phone vibrating on the coffee table shattered the spell. We both pulled back, startled. I should check that, I mumbled, fumbling for the phone. Laura smiled softly, a hint of something unreadable in her expression. Sure, she said, leaning back but not moving away. The air was thick with unspoken words, the room charged with an energy I couldn't ignore. I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The next evening, Laura suggested we relax in the hot tub. I hesitated, trying to think of a way to decline, but her tone was light and casual, leaving me little room to argue without raising suspicion. Eventually, I relented. It was just a hot tub after all. Harmless. When she stepped outside, though, I realized how wrong I'd been. Her sleek black swimsuit hugged her figure in a way that made my chest tighten. The soft glow of the patio lights reflected off her damp skin, and her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, a few strands framing her face. She looked breathtaking. I hated myself for noticing. I quickly averted my eyes and slid into the bubbling water, trying to calm the storm in my head. She followed, settling across from me. For a while, we just sat there, the only sounds coming from the faint hum of the jets and the occasional chirp of crickets. The night was cool, the stars above scattered like tiny diamonds on a velvet backdrop. You know, she said softly, breaking the silence, you've grown into an incredible man. Her words caught me off guard. I looked at her, but her gaze was fixed on the water, her expression unreadable. I laughed nervously. Thanks, I guess. I mean it, she continued, her tone firmer now. She looked up, her eyes locking with mine. You're smart, kind, and, well, let's just say any woman would be lucky to have you. My throat tightened, and I felt heat rise to my face, not from the water, but from the intensity of her words. Laura, Before I could finish, she shifted closer, her movements deliberate yet hesitant, like she was testing the waters. Her hand brushed against mine beneath the surface. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through me. "Laura," I said firmly, pulling my hand away. My voice was steadier than I felt. Her face fell slightly, but she didn't move back. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." The vulnerability in her voice made me pause. I could see the turmoil in her eyes, a mixture of regret and longing that tugged at something deep inside me. But I couldn't let myself go there. I climbed out of the hot tub, grabbing my towel from the nearby chair. "This isn't right," I said, avoiding her gaze as I wrapped the towel around myself. "You're married to my dad." She flinched at my words, her face crumpling for a brief moment before she composed herself. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "You're right," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I'm sorry, Ryan." I looked at her one last time, my heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Without another word, I turned and walked back inside, leaving the warmth of the hot tub and her behind. The next day, I avoided Laura as much as I could. I spent hours behind the wheel, driving aimlessly through winding back roads and empty streets, trying to make sense of the whirlwind in my mind. The guilt was suffocating, a constant weight pressing on my chest. I felt as if I betrayed my dad, even though nothing had truly happened. Yet, the memory of her touch, her closeness, lingered far too vividly. When I finally returned home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. The smell of fresh coffee hung faintly in the air as I stepped into the kitchen. There she was, Laura, standing by the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Ryan, we need to talk," she said softly, almost hesitantly. "I don't think that's a good idea," I muttered, already heading toward the stairs, desperate to escape the conversation I wasn't ready to have. "Please." Her voice broke, catching me off guard. I paused mid-step, my back to her, debating whether to keep going or face whatever storm was brewing between us. After a long silence, I turned around. "Fine. Talk." She inhaled sharply, as if bracing herself. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "For what happened last night. I was out of line. I've just been feeling so lonely, and I let my emotions get the best of me." She took a step closer, her arms falling to her sides. "But I don't want this to ruin things between us, Ryan. Please don't let it." Her vulnerability was disarming. For the first time, I noticed the shadows under her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands. She looked as conflicted as I felt. "It's fine," I said, the words hollow and automatic. We both knew they were a lie. "No, it's not." She shook her head, her voice rising slightly. "You're avoiding me, and I get it. I crossed a line. But I can't stand the thought of you hating me." "I don't hate you," I said quickly, almost too quickly. My voice softened. "It's just complicated." "Complicated?" She stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could see the flicker of tears in her eyes. "Ryan, you can talk to me. Please." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I feel like I'm betraying Dad," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Even being in the same room as you right now feels wrong." Her face crumpled at my words, and for a moment I thought she might cry. Instead, she surprised me. She reached out, hesitated, then let her hand rest lightly on my arm. Her touch was warm, grounding. "I miss him too," she said, her voice breaking. "Every single day. But he's gone, Ryan, and we're still here. We can't keep punishing ourselves for being alive." Her words hit me like a wave, stirring something deep and unspoken. I wanted to pull away, to retreat back into my guilt and confusion, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, letting the moment stretch between us, raw and unguarded. Neither of us knew what would come next. For now, the silence said enough. When my dad returned from his trip, I acted like nothing had happened. Laura did the same, but there was a noticeable distance between us. I left a few days later, cutting my visit short. I told my dad I had to get back to school early for a project. But the truth was, I couldn't stay in that house any longer. As I drove away, I felt a mixture of relief and regret. I knew I had done the right thing by setting boundaries, but the experience left a scar I couldn't ignore. It's been years since that summer, and I've never told anyone about what happened. Every time I see my dad and Laura together, I feel a pang of guilt. not just for what almost happened, but for the secret I continue to keep. Looking back, I realize how easily boundaries can blur, especially when emotions are involved. The experience taught me the importance of loyalty, integrity, and the devastating consequences of crossing lines that should never be crossed.